The Huntsville Execution Chamber. The chamber behind the walls. There is a room in Huntsville that most people will never see. No windows. No audience. No second chances. Inside this room, the state of Texas carries out one of its most controversial powers, the legal execution of prisoners sentenced to death. For decades, this single location has been the final destination for hundreds of inmates from across Texas. Not multiple prisons. Not different cities. Just one place. The Huntsville Unit, more commonly known as the Walls Unit, houses the state's execution chamber. And what happens inside that chamber is tightly controlled, carefully documented, and often misunderstood. Tonight, we're going inside the Huntsville Execution Chamber, not through speculation or myth, but through verified records, official procedures, and documented history. Because behind every execution, there is a system. And that system has evolved, been challenged, and continues to raise questions that remain unanswered. Why Huntsville?
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
To understand the execution chamber, you first have to understand why it exists in Huntsville and nowhere else in Texas. The answer goes back more than a century. In the late 1800s, Texas began centralizing its prison system. Huntsville became the administrative hub of what would eventually become the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, often abbreviated as TDCJ. By the early 20th century, executions were already being carried out here, but not in the way we think of today. At the time, executions in Texas were performed by hanging, often in county jails. That changed in 1923, when the state introduced the electric chair as its official method of execution. That electric chair, famously nicknamed Old Sparky, was installed inside the Huntsville Unit. From that point forward, all executions in Texas were centralized in Huntsville. And that decision, made over 100 years ago, still shapes how executions are carried out today. Between 1924 and 1964, hundreds of executions were conducted using electrocution at the Huntsville Unit. But everything changed in the 1970s. In 1972, the Furman v. Georgia ruling by the U.S. South Supreme Court effectively halted executions nationwide, declaring existing death penalty laws unconstitutional due to inconsistent application. For several years, executions stopped entirely. But Texas was one of the first states to revise its laws in response. In 1976, the Gregg v. Georgia decision reinstated the death penalty under new legal frameworks. Texas resumed executions shortly after, and once again Huntsville became the center. But there was one major difference. The method would change. In 1982, Texas carried out the first execution in the United States using lethal injection. The inmate was Charlie Brooks Jr. And the location? The same Huntsville Unit. The same prison. A different room. From that moment on, the Huntsville Execution Chamber became the most active execution site in the United States. As of publicly available records, Texas has carried out more executions than any other state since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. With all executions taking place inside this single chamber. No rotation. No alternatives. Just Huntsville. And that raises a critical question. What does that chamber actually look like, and what happens inside it? Inside the execution chamber. The execution chamber inside the Huntsville Unit is not designed to be dramatic. It is designed to be controlled. According to official descriptions from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the room is relatively small and clinical in appearance. At the center is a padded gurney, where the inmate is secured using straps across the arms, legs, and torso. There are no theatrical elements. No elaborate machinery. Just medical equipment. Adjacent to the chamber is a separate viewing room, divided by glass. This is where official witnesses observe the execution. Witnesses typically include victims' family members, the inmates' chosen witnesses, members of the press, official representatives of the state. Another room, not visible to witnesses, houses the personnel responsible for administering the lethal injection. Their identities are not publicly disclosed. This anonymity is intentional, a policy designed to protect those involved in carrying out executions. The process itself follows a strict protocol. Once the inmate is brought into the chamber, they are secured to the gurney. Intravenous lines are inserted, usually into the arms. If standard access is not possible, alternative methods may be used, but those details are rarely disclosed publicly. The inmate is then given the opportunity to make a final statement. This statement is recorded and later released by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. After the statement, or if the inmate declines, the execution proceeds. The lethal injection protocol used by Texas has changed over time. Originally, it involved a 3-drug combination. However, due to legal challenges and issues surrounding drug availability, Texas now uses a single drug protocol, typically involving pentobarbital. Once administered, the drug is intended to induce unconsciousness followed by death. The entire process, according to official reports, can take several minutes. But exact durations vary from case to case. And not every execution has gone exactly as planned. Some have drawn scrutiny. Others have sparked legal challenges. And some details remain contested. Which leads to the next chapter, not just how executions happen, but how they've been questioned. Controversies, legal challenges, and documented disputes. For decades, what happens inside the Huntsville execution chamber has not gone unquestioned. While the procedures are documented and standardized, the experience of execution, and whether it meets constitutional standards, has been the subject of repeated legal challenges. At the center of many of these challenges is a single issue: does lethal injection cause unnecessary pain? Under the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, punishments that are considered cruel and unusual are prohibited. That standard has been used by inmates and legal teams to challenge execution methods, including those used in Texas. One of the most significant national cases was BazeVRees. Although the case focused on Kentucky's protocol, its ruling affected execution procedures across the United States, including Texas. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately upheld lethal injection as constitutional, but it also acknowledged that methods could be challenged if they posed a substantial risk of serious harm. That left room for continued legal battles. And those battles have continued, often tied directly to what happens inside the Huntsville chamber. Drug protocol controversies. Texas originally used a 3-drug protocol: an anesthetic, a paralytic agent, a drug to stop the heart. Critics argued that if the anesthetic failed, the inmate could remain conscious while experiencing the effects of the other drugs, including paralysis and cardiac arrest. Over time, legal pressure and drug shortages led Texas to adopt a single drug protocol using pentobarbital. But that change brought new questions. Where do the drugs come from? And how reliable are they? Texas has faced multiple lawsuits seeking transparency about its drug suppliers. State officials have resisted disclosing this information, citing security concerns. Courts have issued mixed rulings, and in many cases, the identities of suppliers remain confidential. This lack of transparency has been a major point of criticism. Execution delays and complications. Not every execution proceeds exactly as planned. In some documented cases across the United States, including those referenced in filings involving Texas, issues have been raised about difficulty inserting 4 lines, extended execution times, visible reactions during the process. It's important to be precise here. While some executions in other states have been widely reported as problematic, each case in Texas is assessed individually, and not all allegations have been confirmed by courts. Some claims remain disputed. Others have been dismissed after review. But the existence of these claims has contributed to ongoing scrutiny of the Huntsville chamber. Last-minute appeals. Another defining feature of executions in Huntsville is how often they come down to the final hours. Inmates frequently file last-minute appeals, sometimes just hours before the scheduled execution. These appeals can involve claims of new evidence, questions about legal representation, challenges to execution methods. In many cases, these appeals are reviewed by multiple courts in rapid succession. Occasionally, executions are delayed or halted. But more often, the courts allow the execution to proceed. This creates a high-stakes timeline, where decisions made outside the chamber directly determine what happens inside it. Public and international pressure. The Huntsville execution chamber has also been the focus of international attention. Human rights organizations, foreign governments, and advocacy groups have all raised concerns about the death penalty in Texas. Some cases have drawn diplomatic involvement, particularly when foreign nationals were executed. These cases have raised questions about compliance with international agreements, including those related to consular access. Texas has generally maintained that it operates within U.S. law and court rulings. But the tension between state authority and international criticism remains unresolved. A system under constant review. What makes the Huntsville chamber unique is not just how often it is used, but how often it is challenged. Every execution is scheduled. reviewed, documented, and, in many cases, contested. And yet, despite decades of legal battles, the chamber remains in operation. Which brings us to the next question. Who are the people behind this process? Not the inmates, but the officials, the staff, the individuals whose roles are largely hidden from public view. The people behind the process. When people think about executions, they often focus on the inmate. But inside the Huntsville Unit, an execution involves a structured team of individuals, each with a defined role. And many of those roles are intentionally kept out of public view. The execution team, the personnel who physically carry out the execution, are not publicly identified. This policy is enforced by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. According to official statements, this anonymity is meant to protect staff from harassment, threats, or public pressure. What is known is that the execution team is trained specifically for this task. They follow a written protocol, and their actions are coordinated with precise timing. But beyond that, details about their identities, backgrounds, or experiences are not publicly disclosed. The warden's role. The warden of the Huntsville Unit plays a visible and documented role in the execution process. They are responsible for overseeing the procedure, confirming the inmate's identity, giving the final signal for the execution to begin. The warden is also present during the final moments. Their role is administrative, but also symbolic. They represent the authority of the state. The chaplain, a prison chaplain, is typically present with the inmate in the final hours. This role includes providing spiritual support, facilitating last rites or prayers if requested, remaining with the inmate up to the execution chamber. In some cases, inmates have requested spiritual advisors of their own choosing. This has led to legal disputes over who is allowed inside the chamber during the execution itself. Some cases have reached federal courts, particularly regarding religious rites. The medical presence. Executions in Texas involve medical procedures, but not in the way hospitals do. Medical professionals are involved in limited roles such as inserting 4 lines, monitoring certain physical indicators. However, ethical guidelines from major medical organizations discourage physicians from actively participating in executions. As a result, the exact level of medical involvement can vary and is not always fully transparent. The witnesses. Executions at Huntsville are not conducted in total secrecy. A select group of witnesses is allowed to observe. This includes victims' families, the inmates' chosen witnesses, journalists, official state representatives. Witnesses observe the execution through a glass partition. They do not hear everything clearly, and their perspectives are limited to what is visible from the viewing room. Afterward, members of the press often provide detailed accounts based on what they observed. These accounts form a significant portion of the public record about executions in Texas. A controlled environment. Every person inside the Huntsville execution chamber operates within strict boundaries. There is a fixed timeline, a defined script of actions, limited communication. No one improvises. No one deviates from the protocol. And yet, despite this level of control, each execution is still a unique event, shaped by the individual case, the legal context, and the final moments of the inmate involved. The final hour, a documented timeline. In the Huntsville Unit, executions are not carried out spontaneously. They follow a structured timeline, one that has been refined over decades and documented through official procedures and witness reports. While exact details can vary slightly from case to case, the overall sequence remains consistent. What happens in the final hour is one of the most controlled processes in the entire Texas prison system. 60 minutes. Final preparation. Approximately 1 hour before the scheduled execution, the inmate is moved into a holding area near the execution chamber. This is not the general death row housing unit. It is a separate, secure location designed specifically for final procedures. At this stage, the inmate is searched. Identification is confirmed. Staff review the execution order. If the inmate has requested a spiritual advisor, that person may be present during this time, depending on court rulings and prison policy. There is no public audience. No cameras. Only staff and, in some cases, clergy. The last meal. Historically, inmates were offered a final meal of their choosing. However, in 2011, Texas ended this practice after a widely reported case in which an inmate requested a large meal but did not eat it. Since then, inmates are typically served the same meal provided to other prisoners. This policy change was confirmed by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Details about individual meals are sometimes reported, but not always officially documented. 30 minutes. Movement to the chamber roughly 30 minutes before the scheduled time, the inmate is escorted to the execution chamber. This movement is conducted under heavy supervision. At this point, the process becomes more visible, at least to those involved. Inside the chamber, the gurney is prepared. Medical equipment is checked. Staff take assigned positions. The inmate is then secured to the gurney using straps. This includes restraints across the arms, the legs, the torso. According to official procedure, the goal is to minimize movement and ensure stability during the injection. 4-line placement. Intravenous lines are inserted, typically into the arms. This step is one of the most sensitive parts of the process. If veins are difficult to access, additional time may be required. In some documented cases, including filings and witness reports, delays have occurred at this stage. However, the specifics of each case are not always fully disclosed. Once the 4 lines are in place, they are connected to tubing that leads to the execution room where the drugs are administered. This room is not visible to witnesses. T0. Witnesses enter. Shortly before the execution begins, witnesses are escorted into the viewing room. They are positioned behind a glass partition. The room is quiet. There is no interaction between witnesses and the inmate, aside from visual contact. At this point, the process transitions from preparation to execution. The final statement. Before the drugs are administered, the inmate is given the opportunity to make a final statement. This is a documented part of the procedure. The statement may include messages to family, apologies, religious expressions, or, in some cases, no statement at all. These final words are recorded and later released publicly by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Some statements are brief. Others are longer and more detailed. But once the statement ends, or is declined, the process continues without interruption. The execution. The warden gives the signal. The lethal injection is administered from the adjacent room. Texas currently uses a single drug protocol, typically involving pentobarbital. According to official descriptions, the drug is intended to induce unconsciousness, depress the central nervous system, result in death. Witness accounts often describe a sequence where the inmate loses consciousness, breathing slows, movement ceases. However, the exact timing can vary. In some cases, witnesses have reported visible reactions. In others, the process appears relatively quick. These observations are based on witness reports and are not always medically verified in public records. Time of death. A medical official, whose role is limited, confirms when death has occurred. The official time of death is recorded. This information is later released in official statements. The witnesses are then escorted out. The chamber is cleared, and preparations begin for documentation and reporting. After the execution, the process does not end when the execution is complete. Following the procedure, a formal report is filed. The inmate's final statement is published. Media outlets release witness accounts. The body is transferred according to standard procedures, which may include release to family or designated services. A process measured in minutes. From the moment the inmate enters the chamber to the official time of death, the entire process typically takes a relatively short period of time. But those minutes are the result of years of legal review, policy changes, and procedural refinement. Every step is planned, documented, and, in many cases, debated. Because what happens in that final hour is not just about one individual. It reflects the operation of an entire system. The numbers behind Huntsville. The Huntsville execution chamber is not just a location. It is part of a larger statistical reality, one that places Texas at the center of the modern death penalty in the United States. Texas and the death penalty. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976, Texas has carried out more executions than any other U.S. state. All of those executions have taken place at the Huntsville Unit. This centralization is unique. Other states may use multiple facilities. Texas uses one. Execution totals. According to publicly available data from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the number of executions carried out by Texas since 1982 exceeds 500. Each of those executions followed the same general process, scheduled through the courts, conducted at Huntsville, documented and reported afterward. The consistency of location and procedure has made Huntsville one of the most studied execution sites in the country. Death row population. Texas also maintains one of the largest death row populations in the United States. However, the number of inmates on death row has fluctuated over time due to new sentences, appeals and reversals, natural deaths, Executions. Death row inmates in Texas are housed at a separate facility, not at Huntsville. They are transferred to Huntsville only when an execution date is imminent. Trends over time. Execution rates in Texas have changed over the decades. The early 2000s saw some of the highest numbers. In more recent years, the number of executions per year has declined. This decline has been linked to several factors, including increased legal scrutiny, changes in jury sentencing trends, advances in forensic evidence. However, the death penalty remains legal in Texas, and the Huntsville chamber remains active. A single location, hundreds of cases. What makes Huntsville different is not just the number of executions, but the concentration. Every case, every inmate, every execution, all in one place. This has created a detailed historical record, one that continues to grow. And yet, despite all the data, one question continues to divide public opinion. Should this system continue at all? The Huntsville execution chamber is one room, but it represents decades of law, controversy, and irreversible decisions. What happens inside it is documented, debated, and still evolving. The question is no longer just how it works, but whether it should continue. If you found this documentary insightful, subscribe to Life Behind Bars for more real, factual stories from inside the world most people never see. And let me know in the comments, should systems like this change or stay the same?